Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating, data-driven story of a nation in massive transition. We're going to objectively compare the huge macroeconomic shifts we've seen in India over the last few decades. Specifically, we'll weigh its foundational era, which spans from independence right up to 2014, against this incredible recent acceleration phase from 2014 aiming toward 2026. By digging into the hard numbers across education, manufacturing, and exports, we get a real, tangible sense of how an entire economy shifts its gears from basic survival to major global ambition.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our mental roadmap for today. We'll start with the two areas of India. Then we'll look at the scaling up of premier education, the manufacturing and electronics boom, and the absolute surge in defense exports. Finally, we'll ground things by covering persistent structural challenges and wrap up with a look at India's competitive future. Section 1. The two eras of India. We are comparing the steady institution building of 1947 to 2014 with the quantitative explosion from 2014 to 2026. To truly understand where an economy is going, you absolutely have to understand how it was built. Tracing the timeline back to 1947, India faced immense, almost unimaginable resource constraints. The entire focus back then was on basic nation building under a closed import substitution economy. Fast forward in 1991, and we see the foundational liberalization, basically opening the doors to the world, which sparked steady, albeit slower growth. But notice the shift right around 2014. This is where the data marks a very distinct acceleration. We start seeing targeted policies specifically designed to push the country toward modern global competitiveness by 2026. So that closed economy foundation gradually and then suddenly paved the way for today's ambition. And you can really see the logic and flow between these two distinct eras. During that long stretch from 1947 to 2014, the growth was all about building core institutions. It was an era defined by working with what you had: resource constraints, gradual building, modest global integration. But here's the thing. That earlier, constrained era essentially built the necessary base for what came next. From 2014 onward, the entire strategy flips to explosive scaling. It's suddenly driven by targeted policy incentives and strategic indigenization. Basically, a concerted, massive effort to make things at home rather than constantly buying them from abroad.
Section 2. Scaling up premier education. Let's look at this explosive growth.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that you just can't build a globally competitive economy without a highly educated workforce, right? Check out the sheer velocity of growth in premier education. For decades leading up to 2014, India had built a total of 387 medical colleges. But fast forward just a bit to this 2024-2026 window, and that number nearly doubles to somewhere between 731 and 818. Undergraduate MBBS seats surged from roughly 51,000 to well over 1.12 lakh. That is a 118 to 151% increase. Postgraduate seats saw an even steeper climb, jumping up by roughly 163%. And this wasn't just growth for the sake of padding the stats. It was a highly targeted effort to address severe, real-world doctor shortages and improve access in historically underserved regions. And it definitely wasn't just medical colleges. The contrast in data regarding India's absolute most prestigious institutions is pretty staggering. Before 2014, there were only 7 or 8 AIIMS hospitals, about 16 IITs for engineering and 13 IIMs for management. Post-2014, there's this massive, sweeping decentralization. We're talking up to 26 AIIMS, 23 IITs, and 21 IIMs today. These core institutions were rapidly expanded to serve a much larger slice of the population, effectively taking elite education and making it accessible across the nation, rather than just hoarding it in a few major metropolitan hubs. In fact, the source material summarizes this shift beautifully. Post-2014 saw explosive scaling to serve a larger, more aspirational population. That word right there, aspirational, that is the key. It represents a fundamental psychological shift in the data. We're moving from a system designed just for basic survival to one that's literally built for nationwide ambition. Section 3. The manufacturing and electronics boom. So what actually happens when you pair an aspirational population with aggressive new economic policies? Well, you get a classic underdog narrative. It's the story of moving from heavy import dependence to fierce self-reliance. But we do need to look at the whole picture first. Historically, India's manufacturing has kind of always lagged behind its booming services sector. Post-2014, under initiatives like Make in India, the absolute manufacturing output actually rose significantly, hitting roughly $456 billion by 2022. But, and here is the pivot we really need to understand, its share of the total GDP remained stubbornly stagnant, hovering around 13 to 17%. Why? Well, because services and agriculture were also growing incredibly fast at the same time, and the informal sector was facing real challenges, which actually led to a slight decline in the employment share. Deep structural issues involving land, labor, and skills are still limiting the broader manufacturing sector. However, if you look within that broader manufacturing landscape, there is a mind-blowing bright spot, a 100 to 127 times jump. Just let that multiplier sink in for a second. We're not talking about a percentage increase. We are talking about a massive, game-changing multiplier regarding mobile phone exports. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we mean. Just think about the 2014-2015 figures for a moment. Mobile exports were near zero, literally sitting at roughly 0.01 lakh crore rupees. Then compare that to the projections for 2024-2025, which absolutely skyrocket to approximately 2 lakh crore rupees. This surge was heavily driven by targeted PLI, or production-linked incentive schemes, which successfully convinced the global smartphone ecosystem, including massive players like Apple, to actually set up shop and manufacture in India. So, why does this matter to us as observers of global economics? Because today, over 99% of India's domestic mobile consumption is made in India. The number of active manufacturing units went from just 2 to over 300. In barely a decade, India completely transformed from being a heavy reliant importer to becoming the world's second-largest mobile manufacturer by volume. It is a profound, almost overnight transformation in a single, high-potential targeted area. Section 4. The defense export surge. Going from an importer to an exporter. Now, this high-growth strategy wasn't just limited to consumer electronics. While overall merchandise exports grew at a steady clip, the defense sector completely stole the show with a dramatic 50 to 56 times increase. Again, we're talking about an entire heavy industry multiplying its output by a factor of 50 in a remarkably compressed time frame. Back in the 2013-2014 financial year, defense exports were barely a blip, just 686 crore rupees. India was heavily import-dependent for its security. But looking at the 2025-26 projections, that number surges to over 38,000 crore rupees. A country globally known for buying its defense equipment has rapidly transformed into a serious emerging global exporter. And let's be clear, this wasn't an accident. India is now exporting things like missiles, radars, and vessels to over 80 different countries. This was the direct result of scaled-up research and development, finally bringing the private sector into the fold, and the rollout of positive indigenization lists. Those lists essentially mandated that certain critical defense platforms absolutely must be manufactured domestically.
Section 5. Let's move to and see how this builds the persistent structural challenges.
Now, as staggering as the numbers we just went through are, a transformation of this sheer scale is never without its friction points. The data clearly points out the hurdles that are still very much in the way. In education, there is a real ongoing challenge in balancing quality versus quantity, making sure that the newer IITs and IIMs has the faculty and the research output to actually match their historic counterparts. In the economy, that stagnant 13 to 17% manufacturing GDP share we talked about, it's a stark reminder that the official target of 25% is still a long way off. Serious gaps in infrastructure and logistics still exist, and sustaining this massive growth against fierce global competition is going to require massive, continuous efforts in skilling up the workforce.
Section 6. India's competitive future and the path forward.
So, where does all this data actually leave us? What do these two distinct eras mean for the next decade? Well, the crucial point is that the path forward relies on a few absolutely key pillars. India has to fully leverage its demographic dividend, meaning that massive, newly educated, and highly aspirational youth population we discussed. It also requires sustaining their aggressive digital push and ensuring policy continuity, like rolling out PLI 2.0 and breaking into the incredibly complex semiconductor manufacturing space. If they can tackle those structural hurdles we just outlined, these targeted successes have the power to drive truly inclusive, resilient regional growth. The macro shift from basic survival to global competitiveness has undeniably occurred. Which leaves us with this final pivotal question. Will continued reforms actually sustain this acceleration toward developed nation status?
The foundation has clearly been built. The acceleration has been triggered, but, the most difficult part of the climb might just be beginning. It's a historic economic transformation, and as people who closely follow these trends, it is absolutely fascinating to watch unfold. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.